32 teams in 32 days. This is episode 23, the Baltimore Ravens episode. Let's welcome in Kevin Oestreicher, host of the Locked On Ravens podcast. Kevin, what's going on?
Hey, Jake, it's a pleasure to be on here with you.
Glad to have you in. So it was another tough postseason exit for Baltimore. They finally got their playoff win under their belt, but then a slow start in Buffalo. Lamar goes down and, boom, this turns into another huge offseason for the Ravens. What was the feeling in the fan base after the playoff loss in Buffalo?
Yeah, it was tough. I think partially because there were such high hopes for the season. Obviously, Lamar Jackson was the MVP in 2019, and going into the year, it was all right. How can Lamar Jackson get better? How can Lamar Jackson continue to elevate his game? And in ways he did, in other ways he didn't do it so much. And I think part of it just had to do with the fact that, look, he had 43 total touchdowns in 2019. For anybody, that's pretty hard to replicate. And so while his stats regressed, I think he did improve in other areas. And again, improvement in deep ball accuracy heading into this offseason is a big point for him. And he's begun to work over the middle of the field a lot. That's where he is known to throw the football. But he is a good outside thrower. He just prefers the middle of the field. I think every quarterback has those preferences. In the game against Buffalo, it was rough. The offense did not perform. The defense played exceptionally. There were only a couple plays where you really thought, all right, this is probably on the defense. But they held Josh Allen and Stephon Diggs relatively in check, but the offense just could not get anything going whatsoever. And part of it was the offensive line. One of the theories I put into play and I go by is it doesn't matter how good your quarterback is, your running backs are, your wide receivers, tight ends. If you can't block anyone and there's a defensive player in the offensive backfield in 2 seconds, I mean, I don't think there's anything anybody can do, even if you're Lamar Jackson, Patrick Mahomes, any of those guys. So going into the offseason, offensive line was a big priority for them. But I think there's excitement in Baltimore now just because of the fact that, yeah, it was a disappointing end to the season. But with most of the roster returning, there were a few big losses, but with most of the roster returning and a couple big acquisitions and the draft, of course, I think that there is reason for optimism in Baltimore because this team is a Super Bowl contender, in my opinion.
Right. I mean, they're just 2 years away from going 14-2, and obviously
Right.
the game against Tennessee a couple of years ago was a rough year. Got their revenge last year, but we saw how some players kind of degressed throughout the year after they got COVID or if they got COVID. Lamar didn't. He got COVID and they had his probably the 6 or 7 best games of his season because he started off hot against Cleveland and then really didn't look great. He was 23rd, 24th ranked quarterback in completion percentage, yards per game towards the middle of the year. Then he got COVID. Then he was on fire the last 6-7 games of the year heading into January and the playoffs. What did you make of that?
Yeah, it was interesting, Jake. I mean, this Ravens team really struggled to find an identity early in the season. I think they were trying to do a little bit too much on the offensive side of the ball, especially when it came to throwing the football. Now, in 2019, Lamar Jackson, I'm going to say this now just so that's a preface, he can throw the football. He's a good thrower of the football, but the Ravens had a historic rushing offense in 2019, literally the best of all time, one of the best of all time. And they kind of moved away from that. Obviously, that 38-6 victory against Cleveland in week 1, that's a great start to a year. But then it felt like the Ravens, particularly Lamar Jackson and Greg Roman to an extent, were trying to force feed receivers and throw the football more than they were running it. And in turn, it started to turn into this thing of like, all right, is this Ravens team a run-first offense, or are they starting to turn into this pass-happy offense when really in 2019, the run game is what brought them to that 14-2 record? And, you can be a run-heavy team while still throwing the football. I think that's a misconception some people have, where if you're any NFL team, it doesn't matter how good you are at running the football. If you run it 50 times and pass it no times, you're not going to win the game because teams will just stack the box, and that's that. So you have to be able to have your run game play off your pass game and vice versa, the pass game play off of the run game. So with Lamar Jackson, obviously gets COVID, really bad situation in Baltimore. Tons of players got it, coaches, families. It was bad. And, I would say they probably had the biggest COVID outbreak in the entire NFL last season. They maneuvered through that. They almost beat Pittsburgh with what pretty much was their
Wednesday Night
quadruple A
Football.
team. Right, exactly. Started off is Thursday night, goes to Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. I think it gets played on Wednesday. So all these different maneuvers where the team has to say, all right, are we playing today? Are we waiting another week? Is there going to be a week 18? All this different stuff. But then Lamar Jackson comes back and the team starts to get back to, I think, what their identity should have been throughout the whole year, which was just running the football. Mark Ingram, great player in 2019, 15 total touchdowns, doesn't really have the juice he had in 2019, kind of gets phased out of the offense. J.K. Dobbins, Gus Edwards take over. J.K. Dobbins, phenomenal. Same thing with Gus Edwards. Those will be the guys heading forward and moving forward. But now it's something where the Ravens have this identity now, and I think they should stick with it. I don't think they have to go through that learning phase again, because for 2 straight seasons, they've had their success running the football. Lamar Jackson is the better thrower of the football when the Ravens are running better because, again, teams can't stack the box against him. And of course, for any runner, whether it's a quarterback, running back, whatever, it makes it harder to run the football. And then when teams stack the box and you're running the football well, Lamar Jackson can just throw it over the top. And then teams have to respect that. So it kind of puts them in a bind. So Lamar Jackson, rough start to the season in the Ravens offense in general. I'm not just putting on him at all. Greg Roman's caught a lot of flack for his part in all this too. But I will say that I'm glad they found their identity at the end of the season.
Yeah, and it's funny that you mentioned Greg Roman because Ravens Twitter was not very happy with him, especially during that game against Buffalo. Like, people were like, fire Greg Roman, fire Greg Roman. I'm like, Greg Roman is the scheme, right? So like, it's kind of like, why? Like, what's going on?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing because Greg Roman obviously has been pretty much the builder. He's constructed this amazing run offense. But you look at his history, was the offensive coordinator in San Francisco during the 49ers Super Bowl run with Colin Kaepernick. Great rushing offense then. Didn't really have it as a passing offense. They ranked in the bottom half of the league. Same thing in Buffalo. Great rushing offense there. Not really a great passing offense. And it's been a thing where Greg Roman has a phenomenal 1 year. He'll have this 1 year hit where this offense that he runs is just amazing. It's great. It hits on all cylinders. And then you start to see a bit of a drop off. And so if you take that and put it into what the Ravens did and what's happening with this team, 2019, historic levels of offense. Amazing, scoring 40 points. It was honestly something where it's like, all right, are they going to score 50? Like, they could do it every single week. But now you head into 2020, don't have the offensive output you expect, and it's all right. It's the Greg Roman thing. This is happening again. Get out of it while you can so it doesn't keep regressing and continue to regress. So the Ravens bring in a bunch of nice coaches, Keith Williams and T. Martin, to be able to help Keith Williams working with Sami Watkins, who signed in Baltimore. Guys like Tyreek Hill, Devontae Adams. Those are all phenomenal guys who the Ravens wide receiver core right now, the veteran in that room, is Sami Watkins. He's 27 years old. They have 23-year-olds, 24-year-olds. That's tough, especially with Lamar Jackson, because it's such a young offense. They needed to get those veterans. So now Roman can bounce ideas off of those guys. But the passing offense does have to change. They do have to improve their scheme. A lot of simplistic routes and some complicated ones too. I'm not, putting all the blame on Roman, but it seems like based off of practice clips we've seen other players post and some cryptic messages that former Ravens such as Des Bryant have posted as well, Roman seems to be the guy who is the fall guy in this situation where if the Ravens don't get off to a hot start in 2021, we could easily see him fired in the first 3 or 4 weeks.
That's interesting because, we talk all the time about, Pete Carroll, Sean Payton, guys who hang on to that one Super Bowl run. Kind of the same thing with Harbaugh. Maybe he's just hanging on to 2011, and that's probably why one of his coordinators, offensive coordinator, getting the fall. But let's talk about Sami Watkins. Comes over from Kansas City. The Ravens tried to bring in a top tier guy. I guess this is a 2-part question. Do you buy the whole nobody wants to play with Lamar dynamic? And what were your thoughts on bringing in Sami Watkins?
Yeah, first of all, I don't believe in the nobody wants to play with Lamar thing. I think that part of it gets very overblown. I think what people see when they look at Baltimore, what receivers see when they look at Baltimore, it's an offense that's very run heavy. And, if you're someone who values targets, yards, touchdowns, receptions, you're not going to get a lot of that in Baltimore. Mark Andrews was Lamar Jackson's #1 target in 2020. Mark Andrews is a tight end. And, Mark Andrews is not going anywhere. Mark Andrews, I think, is in Baltimore for a long time. So when you look at it, Juju Smith-Schuster said on Michael Irvin's podcast, he's like, look, Lamar, he's great, but he plays in a very run-heavy offense. His #1 target was Mark Andrews. Those are the points that he made. So I don't think it's a Lamar thing. I think it is a system and a scheme thing to the point where some receivers just don't want to be in that environment. And I can't blame them for that because every player has a different mindset of, all right, this is what I want out of a team that I'm going to. There have been times where Marquise Brown has had frustrations boil over. Des Bryant has had frustrations boil over. And it's not like it's a toxic or anything, but sometimes it can be frustrating for a receiver to block for 30 or 40 snaps a game as opposed to go out there, run routes, catch football, score touchdowns. So I understand it. But with Sammy Watkins kind of transitioning into that second part, I love the signing. I probably would have preferred someone like Corey Davis, maybe Marvin Jones, Emmanuel Sanders, but based off of who was left out there, I think it was a good move for this team. Watkins is 27, as I mentioned a bit earlier, brings a lot of experience, and I think that's the biggest thing here. But during his press conference with Baltimore media, all they could really talk about was, look, I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to play with Lamar Jackson. I told Lamar Jackson, Sammy Watkins said, I told Lamar Jackson, look, this is your show. I just want to be a part of it. So he seems bought in and ready to help and ready to lead, which I think is important in this situation because I mentioned Ravens have a very young offense. And with Watkins in there, some veterans just know things about different cornerbacks or different safeties, different secondaries in the NFL. They know how to find soft spots in an NFL defense. Where if you're looking towards the draft, which I do think Baltimore's going to take a receiver there as well, rookies coming into the NFL just don't have that knowledge yet. And it's nothing against rookies. I mean, talent is talent regardless of how old they are. But at the same time, I don't think the Ravens could have gone into this year with all guys who were 23, 24, 22, those type of ages. That'd be a little rough. So I'm glad they were able to get a veteran. He can play both on the outside and in the slot, which I like a lot. It's that versatility, which I think is really important because the Ravens have a ton of slot guys. Marquise Brown operates better in the slot. James Prochet is going to get a shot. Devin Duvernay, same thing. So now you can have Watkins on the outside. Hopefully Miles Boykin becomes a bit better. He's been a bit of a disappointment throughout his 2 years. But overall, I mean, the Watkins signing does help this offense evolve.
Let's switch sides a little bit. So the pass rush, and then we'll talk about draft needs a bit later. Let's start with the departures. Two big losses on the D line: Yannick Ngakoue, Matt Judon. They're gone. I know they re-signed, restructured a couple guys, but were you expecting to lose those players, and how much of a hole did that leave?
Yeah, for Judon and Ngakoue, I certainly was expecting to lose those two. Baltimore just frankly didn't have enough cap space. I mean, you saw teams like the Patriots and the Texans go and sign like 30 players each. The Ravens just didn't have that luxury. They didn't have it. They had a bit of cap space to work with, and with Judon and Ngakoue, their production was spotty. Ngakoue was a bit of a disappointment after coming over from the Minnesota Vikings. Was just a hair away from a bunch of sacks, but couldn't get the quarterback down. And ultimately, pressures are great and everything. Quarterback hits are great, but in order to be a successful pass rusher in all phases, you have to get the quarterback on the ground and accumulate sacks. So Ngakoue didn't really do that in Baltimore and ends up signing a fully guaranteed deal with the Las Vegas Raiders, which I mean, great for him. Fully guaranteed money's great, but that
a
overall,
now.
Right, exactly.
14
exactly.
3 years.
For someone who's been as dominant as he has, it's a bit surprising. But I think for him, Baltimore just wasn't the right fit for him. They expected him to do a lot, and it's tough. Learning that defense, especially coming over midseason, is a tough ask for anybody. And, I don't blame Ngakoue at all for wanting to go to Las Vegas. I mean, it's a great opportunity for him. And same thing with Judon in New England. I mean, Judon was someone who was loved and is still loved in Baltimore, one of the leaders of that defense, but his production, it seemed like it came in 1 or 2 games a year. It wasn't across the entire 16-game season. It was, hey, I'm going to get like 4 sacks in this game, then not give you anything for like 8 weeks. And that's rough because, you love the good games from him, but at the same time, you need more of a consistent presence, especially for a team in Baltimore who kind of struggles to get pressure on quarterbacks consistently without blitzing. Blitzing is a huge part of Baltimore's defense, and players take advantage of that. But whether it's 4 or even 5-man rushes, there are just times where the quarterback just sits back there all day and has all day to throw the football. And that's not a formula for success, unfortunately. So, I mean, although Judon was loved and everything, I think the Ravens were looking for someone a little bit more consistent. And also just the contract that he got, they could not match that and put it up with his production and say, all right, this is worth paying you. Because for the Ravens, with all the other needs they had, they just couldn't pony up that money for Judon. They ended up bringing back Tyus Bowser instead on a much cheaper deal, a much better deal. And I think that he's going to take on increased responsibilities with Judon and Ngakoue gone. So I was expecting those moves. I think the Ravens, again, are going to rely on Bowser and Pernell McPhee, who they also re-signed to fill those roles. I'm also a big fan of Justin Houston. Houston visited Baltimore, ended up leaving the city without a deal. But still, the Ravens had Sammy Watkins leave without a deal, come back a few days later. So they're reportedly unlikely to sign another unrestricted free agent. They love their compensatory pick, so they're waiting until after that May 3rd deadline. So maybe there's written agreement between the two, but I think that also Houston has interest from the Colts. So we'll see what ends up happening. Also, Melvin Ingram, Ryan Kerrigan still on the market there. So a couple of good options, but I think Houston would far and away fill the holes in the void that Judon and Ngakoue left because he still has a lot in the tank. I mean, 19 sacks over the 2 years he was in Indianapolis. Those are big numbers, especially from a team right now that doesn't have a lot of pass rushing prowess. So I'd expect them to, one, sign a veteran, and two, probably go after someone in the draft.
So I thought Kevin Zeitler was a surprise release. Ravens brought him in for fairly cheap. Still trying to replace Marshall Yanda, who moved around a bit from left guard to right guard throughout his career. Not sure what you're going to get out of Ben Bredesen, who, by the way, was my draft crush last year, and I hated, as a Bengals fan, I hated that the Ravens snagged him. But Zeitler is a immediate starter at right guard. What were your thoughts? Because that was before even free agency began. I believe that was like Sunday morning when free agency began on Monday, so they kind of started off hot there.
Yeah, it was either Sunday or Monday. It was one of the two. It happened before the actual tampering period began. It might have been Monday, but regardless, I think that with Zeitler, again, I mentioned the offensive line earlier in the show, and we were talking about the Buffalo game. This was needed. The Ravens obviously suffered a huge loss when Marshall Yanda retired after the 2019 season. You know, future Hall of Famer, first ballot, in my opinion. They end up going into the year starting Tyree Phillips, who's a rookie third-round right guard who played tackle in college. So they really, I don't think they prepared as well as they should have for that loss. And, you know, they can only do so many things when it comes to rounding out a roster with full needs and a full list of needs there. But Zeitler is an interesting guy because I think he fills what the Ravens need exactly. He's a veteran, has plenty of NFL experience, 3 teams, the Bengals, the Giants, the Browns, and I mean, he's someone who they're going to plug in right at right guard. You know, he's played right guard throughout his entire career, but this actually opens up the offensive line because the tackles are set. Unless Orlando Brown Jr. gets traded, then it's a different story. But right now, at least for the 2021 season, it's Ronnie Stanley on the left side and Orlando Brown Jr. on the right side with Kevin Zeitler next to Orlando Brown at right guard. So now what you have is center Bradley Bozeman, and I say center because he played center in Alabama. And what I think the Ravens are going to try to do is move him to center because that was his natural position. And he's a great left guard. You know, no qualms about him playing left guard. But what I think they might try to do is move Ben Powers, who was the right guard last year, who ended the season at right guard, move him over to the left side next to Ronnie Stanley and put Bradley Bozeman at center. If they don't decide to do that, if they say, hey, we want Bradley Bozeman at left guard and we want left guard Bradley Bozeman, they could draft someone, maybe Creed Humphrey, Landon Dickerson, assuming his injury history is all good and everything's squared away there. But I think the Zeitler signing, it's a veteran presence, again, a very young offensive line, not having Marshall Yanda, and, you know, a bunch of leadership there. You mentioned Ben Bredesen. I still think he can make an impact. I think it'll be probably as a backup unless injuries hit, but I'm with you. I love Bredesen as well. I was honestly happier with the Bredesen pick than I was with the Phillips pick, and,
Yeah, no, me
you know,
too.
that says something. Because it's just like, you know, for Tyree Phillips, great prospect, a lot of developmental work, and same thing with Bredesen. But I think Bredesen brings better interior experience, and Phillips is working on his foot speed right now. But regardless, I think Zeitler is someone who's going to come in, give them probably 2 or 3 good years of football, 2 good, 3 consistent years of football, while they figure out the Orlando Brown Jr. situation and figure out what the rest of their interior looks like. I mean, at least they know that they have someone, you know, injuries willing, you know, hopefully no injuries happen, but injuries willing, know that they have someone who can come in and give them good football and good snaps for at least probably 2 years.
Yeah, and it was funny. When they took Phillips, I was like, "Oh, that's a reach. That's a complete reach." And then the next day they took Bredesen. I'm like, "Shit." But so you mentioned the 2 tackles, Brown, Stanley. Stanley is suffering a torn ACL. Later in the year, we expect him to be fully back, fully healthy, play left tackle. I think he's the second best left tackle in the league when he's healthy. Orlando Brown, we don't know. Like, what are your thoughts on him? Do you expect Stanley and Brown to be the left tackle and right tackle week 1?
I do at this point. You know, there is some momentum. You know, all the NFL rumors accounts. Who knows how true those are? You know, I don't put any stock in those, but you know, it's just been constant feeding of like, all right, these teams are interested. These are what these teams have offered, and I think there is interest in him, and teams have offered compensation. But the Ravens have to look themselves in the mirror and say, do we have a better chance of winning a Super Bowl this year with or without Orlando Brown? And the answer is with, because he is a phenomenal right tackle. Same thing with a left tackle. If the Ravens do decide to keep him on the roster for 2021, he's most likely going to leave in 2022. They would then get a 3rd-round compensatory pick because the contract he's going to sign is going to be absurdly massive because he's that good of a player. So, you know, do the Ravens, if they're offered a 2nd-round pick, let's say, in this draft, Is that better than having a full season of Orlando
Right.
Brown and getting a third round pick? Probably not, because you still have that window with him where you don't have to rely on maybe a rookie or a veteran who might not be as good. The Ravens have to also figure out, the stuff with Lamar Jackson. Lamar Jackson, I anticipate to be in Baltimore for a long time. And taking advantage of that rookie deal that he's on right now is important. So if you have a stud left tackle or a stud right tackle, he could be a left tackle too, but a stud right tackle on the roster for a year at a very cheap price, I think that gives you a better chance to win. And, maybe the round up is like, that's great. You got a second round pick. I think the Ravens only move off of Brown Jr. if they're offered at least a first round pick. That's something I'd be all right with, because then you can potentially go in this draft class in a very deep tackle class and replace him right off the bat. But maybe if I'm the Ravens and they're not giving me the offers that I like or anything, I'm not forced, I'm not forced to do anything with this situation, because of the fact that, yeah, Orlando Brown is probably going to leave in 2022, as I mentioned, but at the same time, when he's on the roster, he gives the Ravens the best chance to win. So I'd probably take the third round pick, probably what the Ravens are going to do, but I'd probably do that scenario and say, hey, a second round pick's great, but we're going to take the year of Orlando Brown and get the third.
And it's also a year where it's a contract year. So because he said, or I don't know if it's true, but there are rumors that he said he isn't very happy there, so he might just play out of his mind, like a lot of players do, get more money for himself there, and then obviously Ravens cash in with that third round comp pick. But the Ravens are picking at 27, 58, 104, and 131 with multiple picks in the fifth round. We can start with the wide receiver position. We mentioned it earlier. Devin Duvernay was good last year, returned punts. It's probably a position of need. How do you think they'll attack that in the draft? Do you think they could go there at 27, 58, or later on?
I'd be shocked if the Ravens didn't draft a wide receiver in the first 2 days of this draft. Ending the third round without a receiver would shock me. I think getting a late round wide receiver is pretty redundant at this point. They already have James Prochet from last year, Devin Duvernay, who's going to get a shot. So if I'm drafting a wide receiver from the Ravens, I'm looking for someone who's making an immediate impact. I think Rashad Bateman is the best fit for the Ravens in this class based off of where he'll be available and just the skill set he brings. Terrace Marshall Jr. is someone who's been very linked to the Ravens. Kadarius Toney doesn't really fit the skill set needs, but still is a phenomenal player. So I think those three are targets for them in the first round. I'm in love with Rashad Bateman, so like literally, I would take him in a heartbeat if he's available at 27. I don't anticipate that though. Other later round prospects, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Tylan Wallace, Dimey Brown, guys like that. Des Fitzpatrick, I also love because of his chemistry with Lamar Jackson. The two played together during Fitzpatrick's freshman year at Louisville, so they're definitely going to take a wide receiver. I just feel like this class is too deep for them not to. They also have some later round options, but again, I don't see that being an avenue they explore. I mean, the first round is a good area for them anyway, because there you're getting a dynamic playmaker. They do need an outside presence. I talked about that a bit earlier too. A slot guy like Kadarius Toney, probably would have a bit of overlap with other guys on the roster, but still, talent is talent. And if the Ravens can make it work, they can make it work. So all in all, I think it's probably going to be a day 2 selection. Maybe it's a day 1 selection if the player is right, if the pick is right, because if you have to reach for a guy you really like by 4, 5, 6 picks, that's fine, just to make sure you get him, and that's the guy you want. You don't want to overpay substantially, but if you take a guy 5 picks earlier than usual, then that's fine. So if the Ravens like, for example, Terrace Marshall at 27, and they're worried he's not going to be there at a potential 35 trade back, then sure, take him at 27, get your guy, and be done with it. So there are a lot of options for the Ravens, but again, I'd anticipate them taking one at least on day 2 or maybe day 1.
So pick 27. Could that be defense? Let's say one of the edge rushers falls. Obviously, they lost 2 of their starting pass rushers, Judon and Ngakwe. Let's say Kwity Paye is there. Obviously, a lot of untapped potential with him. Could that be the pick at 27? Probably great value because he's arguably a top 20 player.
It could be. And I think edges, again, that need that I talked about earlier, it's something that's big. I think they're going to try to get a veteran and a guy in the draft. So guys like Kwity Paye, Azeez Ojulari, Jalen Phillips, those are all guys who could be targets for the Ravens. And even mid-round guys, Joseph Ossai, Quincy Roche, Joe Tryon, there are a lot of guys. I think Kwity Paye is probably not going to make it to 27. I think that he's probably going to be gone before then, unfortunately. Same with Rashad Bateman. But still, I think that if Azeez Ojulari is there, I think that's going to be the pick. Obviously, Rashard Bateman not being there, but still. he just seems like the Ravens pick. He's been linked to Baltimore on a ton of different occasions, and it seemed like that same thing with Patrick Queen, where it's like, oh, would you want to play for the Ravens? And he's like, yeah, I'd love that. And Azeez Ojulari said the same thing. So that's not like, a stamp that's saying, hey, you're coming to Baltimore, but it's still, I think the pieces are kind of lining up to maybe it being Ojulari if he's available. But if Pay is there, they have a tough decision if it's the two of them there, because both phenomenal playmakers. This edge class, though, I think there are a few developmental guys. It's a very developmental class. Greg Rousseau is someone who the team could pick at 58. Calais Campbell has raved about him. So I think that it
58,
could be.
58.
Yeah,
He's gonna be
58.
there 58. I mean,
If he is there.
right.
So it's something where, you know, they do need an edge guy. He'll probably be more of a developmental piece. They'll give Bowser, Ferguson, McPhee their shot. Same with the veteran, but they still need someone. So Pay could be it. But at 27, I mean, edge, wide receiver are probably the two picks I'm looking at.
Yep, and I would agree there. So looking into the later rounds, kind of more developmental positions. Obviously, the Ravens had a lot of comp picks last year, a ton of picks. It felt like they were picking every other pick on night two, and they just kept drafting guys, drafting guys, and drafting guys. Not so much this year, but they do have above average amount of picks. What are some positions other than receiver and edge you could see them going? Maybe a developmental tackle to prepare for Orlando Brown leaving.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's one of them that's big. I don't know if I'm necessarily taking one in the first two rounds if Orlando Brown's still going to be on the roster. I don't think you want a prospect of that quality still just on the bench for a full season, where you could probably get one in the next draft and have him play immediately. But still, talent is talent. So if they like a guy enough, they would certainly take him. I think safety is another huge need. Deshaun Elliott played really well replacing Earl Thomas after the whole Earl Thomas debacle happened, but he's not a true free safety. I think what they're probably going to try to do, what Baltimore's going to try to do, is draft a guy who can play single high, kind of play that ball hawking role that Earl Thomas played, and play three safety looks. They can move Chuck Clark down to dime linebacker and put Deshaun Elliott at strong safety. They can do a bunch of different things in three safety looks. The Ravens defense is pretty positionless, so they move guys all over the field in a bunch of different situations. I could see the team also taking a backup slot cornerback, Tavon Young, who is one of the best slot corners in the entire NFL, has missed 3 of the past 5 seasons with season-ending injuries, or season-ending injury has happened in the past 3 of the 5 seasons. So that's another one I could see. Tackle, you mentioned, Jake. I think that's a big one as well. They could take a guard or a center, as I mentioned, with Humphrey or maybe Quinn Miners or something like that. And then also a tight end. I think a tight end could be someone that the Ravens look at. Maybe Brevin Jordan, Pat Fryermuth, Hunter Long. Kyle Pitts will be a dream, but Kyle Pitts is not making it to 27. I can tell you that right now. So I think that, yeah, there are a bunch of positions. The Ravens don't have as many picks as you mentioned, but I think that's a good thing because they have a lot of depth already. I think they wouldn't be able to house, 10 picks this year. They'd have to probably let go of some guys or trade some guys who are currently on their roster. So a bunch of different directions, both on offense and defense, they can go in.
And your safety description, if that is not describing exactly what Trev Morig is, I don't know. I don't know what is. Like, I'm telling you, a cover 3 guy, which Baltimore runs a lot of cover 3, who can play free safety, single high, middle of the field. Like, that's exactly what he is. So if he is there at 27, which I think he probably will be, I'm not exactly sure how NFL teams are viewing the safety class. It looks pretty thin, but if he's there at 27, a consensus top safety in this class, unless Bateman's there, would you run to the podium to make that pick?
I don't know if I'm running, but I might slowly walk. I'm very high on Merrick. I think that he again fills the need. You mentioned it, Jake, and I think I'd be more comfortable with him in a trade back scenario, maybe in the early 30s or late 30s, but I don't think he gets there. So again, this is a situation of if the Ravens love the prospect and they have to reach a few picks to get him, but they think he fills a need and he will take them to the next level. I'm all right with it because the Ravens do need that single high guy, and I think Merrick fills that role. And there are other guys, Javon Holland, Andre Cisco. There are a bunch, but I think Merrick is the best in the class. It's not an overly top heavy class in the fact that there's this stud that's supposed to go top 10, but they have a lot of nice depth, this class does. But I think Merrick would be a great fit, and so if he's there at 27, he's probably not my top selection, but I wouldn't be opposed to it or surprised if they make the pick.
So give me your top 3. Like, obviously Bateman's 1, I would assume. So give me your second and third. If they're there, I'm taking him. Realistic.
Right. In terms of best player available, for me, Bateman fills a need, and he's also the best player available. Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah, the linebacker from Notre Dame, I think is a very nice chess piece, can move all over the field, linebacker, safety, slot corner, literally can do it all, and he doesn't necessarily fill a need, but he would be a best player available in that situation. And then I guess number 3, I think Christian Barmore would be someone who, if he's available, I don't expect him to make it to 27, but the Ravens do have Calais Campbell, Derek Wolfe, Brandon Williams all over the age of 30. Barmore brings that pass rush from the interior, which Baltimore has struggled with for years now, and he would immediately plug and play in there. He'd make a nice tandem with Justin Madubuike in the future. And so having that, again, it's not like this flashy pick like a Rashad Bateman or something like that, but it gives them depth on the interior, and I mean, probably gives them the best defensive line unit in the entire NFL. So those 3, I think, would really help this team out.
Yep, we'll see exactly what they do at pick 27 in about, oh boy, math time. This is episode 21 or
under
21,
2
22.
weeks.
So
Under 2 weeks.
Yeah. I just found out a couple days ago that I will be there in attendance. Very excited for that.
Very nice.
Yeah. So Kevin, thanks so much for coming on, man. You were awesome.
Thanks so much, Jake. It was a pleasure.
Make sure to follow Kevin on Twitter at KOstreicher34. Thank you, everybody, for listening and watching this episode of 32 Teams in 32 Days. I'll catch you in the next one.